First thing I would like to do is invite the recently elected new chairperson of the Board of Directors of NAASR to come up and say a few words, Judy Sarian. Judy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you, Mark. I just wanted to welcome everyone today, this evening, and we are very happy that you're here. We also are happy that we have the virtual audience. I would like to say that it's much more fun to be here in person. We had a wonderful event earlier today at 5 p.m. For young people, and we had a great turnout, and it was really amazing. Katchig Mouradian was in conversation with Julia Hintlian, and they talked about books and reading and translations, and it was totally fascinating. So, and I just think that it's really great when all ages come to NAASR and come here in person, because we just, this is your place as much as NAASR's place. This is for the community. It's for all of us. Please come during the week, come for events, and we'll be really thrilled to see you and greet you here. So thank you so much, and I will turn the microphone back to Mark.
Thanks, Judy. And yes, the earlier event this evening was outstanding. If you were able to be here, and if you were not able to be here, it was recorded, and we will try to arrange to post the video of that in the very near future. So hopefully people won't feel like they missed out by not being here, although it was nice to be here. So indeed, good evening. My name is Mark Memagonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs here at NAASR. Thanks for joining us tonight for Gas Balloons, Emperors, and Armenian Mapmakers, a cartographic journey through the Library of Congress's collections with Dr. Katchig Mouradian. This program is the third of three in 2022, focusing on maps and cartography, a series that has been supported by the Dadurian Foundation, whom we thank for their generosity for a third consecutive year. The first program earlier in the year with Ruben Galician took place in March and can be viewed on our YouTube channel. The second, Mapping the Armenian Highland with Matthew Karanian, took place a week ago, and you can watch that on NAASR's YouTube channel as well. They were both fascinating presentations. And as a final piece, after the talk tonight of our 2022 focus on maps and cartography, NAASR Library Curator Ani Babayan and I are finishing up a Treasures of the NAASR Mouradian Library feature, highlighting some of the map and atlas holdings in our own collections, and this will be published online next week. 2022 has been a year in which NAASR has organized or co-sponsored more than 45 programs. This includes the first conference hosted here at NAASR in our building, The Technologies of Communication and Armenian Narrative Practices Through the Centuries, which was co-organized with the Society for Armenian Studies. And way back at the start of the year, co-sponsoring the major conference is The Pen Mightier Than the Sword, Historians' Disputed Ownership of History and Ethnic Conflict in the South Caucasus, organized by the Armenian Studies Program, Armenian Studies Center of the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. Scanning the list of topics and speakers, I think these programs reflect both a depth and breadth of subject matter as well as a multitude of strong collaborations and partnerships that we take pride in. Are we good? Yes. Okay, good. Starting in the spring of 2020, continuing into this year, the majority of our programs were online due to the COVID-19 virus, that gift that keeps giving. Gradually, hybrid programs such as the one tonight have become more frequent, and we hope to continue to have more such in-person programs that are also live streamed in 2023. We encourage those of you who are able to attend events in person to do so, and we thank you for your interest and attendance in any form, online or in person. I must do my duty also and say that the work we do, both in the realm of public programming, including hybrid programs, and in all aspects of NAASR's work to advance Armenian studies and scholarship, costs money. The work we do only happens with your support. the support of our members and friends and donors. If you appreciate and value the work that NAASR does, as we hope you do, please do what you can by becoming a NAASR member, continuing to be a NAASR member, or donating at any level you are able to. Last week, we lost a dear friend and member of the NAASR Board of Directors, Edward Avedissian. Ed, as most of you know, was a remarkable philanthropist who supported a number of organizations, Armenian and non-Armenian. For NAASR, it was Ed's generosity that allowed us to create our new headquarters that those of you who are here are enjoying tonight, and to create a building that we hope and believe reflects not only well on this organization, but on the entire Armenian community worldwide. Ed was not someone who was interested in personal glory or recognition. On the contrary, he was ill at ease with it. He insisted that this building not bear his name, but the name of Vartan Grigorian, because Vartan Grigorian was someone whom he respected greatly. Ed felt fortunate to be in a position to be able to help organizations that he believed in, and we are fortunate that he believed in NAASR. A couple of nights ago, before our webinar with Umit Kurt, he and I were chatting, and he expressed his sadness about Ed's passing. "Did you know him?" I asked. "Yes," Umit said. "Years ago, he was my classmate in Armenian class at St. James Church in Watertown." "I had no idea he was a wealthy man," Umit said, which tells you a lot about Ed Avedissian. We will miss Ed's kindness, his unpretentious decency, and his commitment to education and to the values of NAASR. But his memory and his legacy will be with us forever. I would like now to show a very short video tribute to Ed that was shown during the 2021 NAASR Virtual Gala when we honored Ed. The slideshow was put together by Arlene Sarian Alexander, and the musical accompaniment you will hear features Edward Avedissian on clarinet with the Armenian Chamber Orchestra. Well, it's now my happy task to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Katchig Mouradian, who's getting a workout today. Judy told you about the earlier program. Katchig is, as they say, hardly a stranger at NAASR, having given his first talk here a little more than 11 years ago when he was the editor of the Armenian Weekly and a doctoral student at Clark University. NAASR, with the Knights of Vartan Fund for Armenian Studies, with which we partner, is proud to have provided support for Katchig's work dating back to his days as a graduate student. He has more than repaid that with his extraordinary productivity. He is the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress and a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He serves as co-principal investigator of the Project on Armenian Genocide Denial at the Global Institute for Advanced Studies at New York University, and he is a member of the NAASR Board of Directors and its Academic Advisory Committee. Katchig is the author of The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918, which received the Syrian Studies Association Honorable Mention for 2021. He is the co-editor of two forthcoming volumes, After the Ottomans, Genocide's Long Shadow, and Armenian Resilience, and Handbook on the Late Ottoman Empire, History and Legacy. He is the editor of the peer-reviewed journal, The Armenian Review. He is a busy guy. I mentioned a moment ago the recognition that the Resistance Network has received from the Syrian Studies Association. Since 2015, NAASR has annually given out the Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prizes for Excellence in Armenian Studies, recognizing important work in the field with separate prizes for scholarly monographs and translations into English. 2 nights ago, I had the pleasure of announcing Umit Kurt as co-winner of the 2022 Aronian Prize for a monograph for his book, The Armenians of Aintab, The Economics of Genocide in an Ottoman Province. Tonight, it's my privilege to announce that Katchig Mouradian is the second co-winner for the Resistance Network. Kurt's and Mouradian's work, each in its own way, has opened up new perspectives and offered new insights on important aspects of the Armenian genocide and its aftermath. I congratulated Umit on Tuesday, and I congratulate Katchig today. Congratulations, Katchig. Let's hear from him. Katchig Mouradian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction and for the award. I've been interacting with you all day, and of course, I had no idea. I wanna start with perhaps, and of course, Edward Avedissian's film sort of made me make that last-minute switch. Mark alluded to this, to the fact that I've received support as a PhD student at Clark during my work since as well from NAASR. But in hindsight, I would say that at every step of my education, from kindergarten to middle school to high school, in civil war-torn Lebanon, and then afterwards at university, I and my sisters have been the recipient of different scholarships that were the only way and the only reason why we could continue our education. So in many ways, a lot is owed to a number of institutions leading up to this moment. And I think a lifetime is needed to repay that, right? And also, hopefully, pay it forward. So the generosity of people like Edward Avedissian and others makes that possible. And there's and this institution, and this building will always be a constant reminder of that. So it's a joy for me and an honor for me to be here today. And as a genocide scholar, I've promised Mark that because this is the holiday season and today is particularly dedicated to the holiday here at NAASR, both of my talks have nothing to do with genocide, and I will not venture in that direction. My talk here tonight is going to be focusing on Armenian cartography. I am not by any stretch an expert in Armenian cartography. What I am is a student of Armenian cartography, and over the past couple of years in my position at the Library of Congress as the Armenian and Georgian area specialist, that journey as a student has increasingly become one where I have enjoyed learning more and more. And as a result, you will see a little bit about here today in tonight's program. You'll hear a little bit about the collection at the Library of Congress, but it's not going to be in any way an exhaustive talk about what the Library of Congress has on the way of maps dedicated to Armenia or related to Armenia and Armenians. I have selected a few maps to tell the story. We are talking about an institution that has the largest collection of maps anywhere on this planet. So we're talking about a vast collection, and I believe that the Armenian collection, small as it is in that large collection, is certainly a wonderful opportunity to research and discuss, and open a conversation about particularly what is referred to as the golden age of Armenian cartography, particularly focusing on the Mkhitarist congregation in the 18th century. So the bulk of my talk is going to be dealing with that part, but I will be moving from there to the later period all the way into the 20th century, early 20th century, and making a short trip to Ethiopia, and that's where the emperor comes in the title, and then also to the First Republic of Armenia, and then Soviet Armenia. So that's the quick overview of what's going to follow. There's going to be one central character who sort of sits in the middle of this, and he is a map maker that I was introduced to through my research, and I have been fascinated by him ever since. And after reading all that I could find on him that's available out there, I've now sort of made it my task to learn more about this person and his life, leading up to the creation of a number of maps that I will be discussing today. Another treat, at least for me, is that I couldn't bring the maps from the Library of Congress, but we've done the next best thing. So we will have 3 maps that I will be discussing, 3 of the 4 maps that I'm going to be discussing today that the Armenian Museum of America has generously offered and brought here, and it's going to be on display right after the talk when we start the Q&A. So you will get to know this person that I'm going to be talking about in the first half of the talk, and then see his work as well, in person for those of you who are in the audience. So a few words first about maps and the way they come into the Armenian consciousness in the modern period. And when I say maps and cartography, I'm using these terms in their modern European sense, and therefore I'm talking about the more recent period, right? There's scholarship on Armenian maps, in Armenian manuscripts. There is, and I will refer to some of the authors and who've done work on this. What I will be covering, however, are the first printed maps that we see in the beginning in late 1600s with the first Armenian map, and then afterwards, as I said, the 18th century, during which we have a school of Armenian cartography emerging in Europe, right? And essentially, and from there, spreading all around the world. One of the things is that it's important to think about audiences here, right? Maps that were produced in Europe at, for example, the Mkhitarist congregation served a number of purposes. from travel to education to just, hanging from the walls of institutions and homes. Merchants use them, and NAASR has featured a number of lectures on Armenian merchants in this period, and the importance, obviously, of maps here is critical. Schools have used them, educators have used them, and one of the largest markets, of course, for these maps in this period was the Ottoman Empire, and particularly Constantinople. So you will see that some of the best-selling maps that I'm going to be talking about essentially become extremely popular there. But it's not just limited to Constantinople. We have, the records indicate, the Mkhitarist records indicate, as well as other sources indicate that, many of these maps that I'm going to be discussing were extremely popular among Armenians all over the world. If you look at the different requests that the Mkhitarist received for these maps to be shipped all over, right? It really is, in and of itself, a global phenomenon. So it's worth, setting the scene in that sense and asking the question, all right, who are these maps being produced for? So it's not surprising that the earliest maps had a particular kind of focus. I'll say a little bit more about this here a little later, but it's worth keeping that in mind as well, right? The audience will often determine the kinds of maps that are produced in this period, as always. So let me start, though, with the central character today. It took 5 years and 6 maps for engraver Father Elia Endasyan, Yeria Endasyan, to make an indelible mark on Armenian cartography. Endasyan's peers describe him as a tall, soft-spoken, adroit and hardworking, this is direct quote, member of the Armenian Catholic Mkhitarist congregation, a beacon of knowledge and education for Armenians since its founding in 1700. It's worth here to mention that the founder, Mkhitar Sepastatsi, of the congregation himself was interested in maps. So he is the first person, as the records indicate, who not only acquires maps. The very first map that is published was hanging, and the very first printed Armenian map that was printed, was hanging in the Mkhitarist congregation. He is also the first to essentially support efforts to train members of the congregation to become engravers and produce maps and purchase the necessary equipment for that. So the creation of maps becomes an important part of the mission of the Mkhitarist congregation. Now, working among the Mkhitarist at the San Lazzaro degli Armeni monastery in Venice, Italy, in the second half of the 18th century, this is a period where there were several transformations in the world of map making, including the Mercator map projection, which was broadly adopted. Endasyan engraved a world map referred to as Hamadarad's Ashkharatsuits. This is his first map. It is a world map in 1784 that employed this Mercator projection for the first time in Armenian cartography. This projection is essentially divides the world into a cylinder, and this is the map we're sometimes used to seeing, right, in a way that all the parallels of latitude, right, have the same length, right? It's not just the equator and then the other is shorter. Very few copies of his first map are printed, but from this very first map that he produces in 1784, we see that everybody is praising him in the congregation, and then there's a lot of interest in ordering copies of this map, right, from Constantinople and elsewhere. However, the congregation did not want to print too many copies of the map because they wanted to make sure that they maintained the integrity of the engraving, because they were keeping the map, the copper engraving, to print the map in a book that was supposed to be forthcoming, right? And therefore, they are hesitant to keep using the same copper plate for mass producing this map. Which is why very few copies of this are printed, initially just 3. And then, even though, so this is a map that is produced in 1784, the map, the book comes out in 1817. The map appears in Chamchan's volume that appears in 1817, the first volume of the book. And that is the first time that it's really widely seen, right? But some scholars argue that this could not have possibly been the first map that this guy is creating because of the degree of detail, expertise that the map indicates and shows. But we don't really know. There's some scholarship that says that it's very possible that a number of engravings and a number of books published by the Mukhtarist were actually done by Elia and Dazian, right? But there's not, I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that regard. So for someone who revolutionized Armenian mapmaking, we know precious little about Endazian. His work tells us that he was a keen follower of the scientific advances of his time. In 1785, right, this is just 1 year after he printed the Hamadarad's Ashkharatsuits, the map, the world map. So less than 2 years after the first manned, untethered hot air balloon and hydrogen balloon flights. So there's this great interest in hot air balloon and hydrogen balloon flights in Europe as the first trials are taking place around this time. And less than 2 years after the first one occurs, we have Elia and Dazian actually writing a booklet, I would say, it's a 16-page monograph titled Hamarot Batmuchun Otabarik Kendo, A Brief History of the Gas Balloon. You are seeing, this is an Elia and Dazian engraving. It is the first page of the book, and it's a beautiful image description, and down there you have a map, the path of the first balloon flight. So the booklet opens with a beautiful full-page engraving of the hydrogen-filled balloon that carried the inventor, Jacques Charles, and his co-pilot, Nicolas Louis Robert, 15 miles from Jardin des Tuileries in Paris to Nes-la-Vallée on 1 December 1783. The engraving includes a small map of the hydrogen balloon's trajectory. This book, which, it's not a well-known book by any stretch, right, becomes a bestseller in Constantinople. In 20 days, 600 copies are sold, right, which would make many academics proud in the 21st century, by the way. So this is not a small feat, right? It essentially, it's extremely popular. I'll show you, this is the first page of the book. And again, it makes Endazian even better known in many circles. So Endazian's next endeavor was a 4-map set, Africa, America, Asia, and Europe, which he completes in 1786 and 1787. These are the ones that you're going to be seeing, 3 of the 4. The continental maps prepared, and I'm quoting here, according to new geographic observations, as their description attests, reflected the knowledge of the period's European cartographers and the ways in which they conveyed it, including pictorial representation of points of interest, as well as other beautiful engravings. So for example, the hydrogen balloon has a cameo. The guy loved the hydrogen balloon. In his Europe map. They also drew on the tradition of the geographic works of the Mukhtaris themselves. So this is the Americas, the map of the Americas. Now, just some information. Many of these maps were not colored. Oftentimes, though, so you will see different collections around the world that have copies of some of these maps. Some have them in color, some have them in black and white. And that's because some of these were actually hand-colored afterwards, depending on demand, right? Some of the additions that are made to these maps, like, some of them are put on pieces of cloth or cardboard, et cetera, that were eventually done, right, did not really end up that popular. It seemed like particularly, when you had these big requests coming from Constantinople, people actually just wanted the map, right? And they didn't want all the additional, gadgets that sort of came with it or attached to it. So these are images, high-resolution images that are also available from the Library of Congress collection. These are scanned from the Geography and Map Division that give, extremely high resolution. This is not doing justice to it. This is a lower resolution version where you can see the different regions, different areas, and the level of detail. A few things to point out here for the North American case. As you notice, the eastern United States is more defined and more detailed. We know less in this period about the northwest, and that is reflected here. And practically very little, in many of the maps from this period, Alaska is just, not there. To give you a sense here of the intricate work that he did, remember, he's engraving all of this, right? And it requires tremendous work. And this is typically in each map, what he did was sort of try to represent that continent in one way or the other, and in ways in which he thought, with the knowledge of the period, was representative. And this is his United States map. This is Europe. I will have, you see there's a lot more detail here. It's worth noting that. And there's a cow there. This is Asia. And this is Africa. Less detail, again, as you can expect. But still, it is based on the best knowledge of the period. The Militarists were influenced by, the European tradition of map making of this period. In fact, some of the maps that are produced by the Militarists before this, you do have European, non-Armenian, non-members of the congregation, map makers, either assisting or playing a critical role in the making of these maps. It's eventually, though, by the time we're talking about Elia and Dacian, who essentially is revolutionizing map making in the Mkhitarist congregation, this becomes an in-house operation almost entirely, right? So there's this expertise that initially is coming in, but eventually you have greater, independence in that sense. Just a quick note here. You see there's the Black Sea in the north here and the Caspian. It's worth noting that oftentimes many of these maps can be dated, and oftentimes they are dated because there is no date on them, by looking at either the boundaries, right? You can have a sense because the boundaries, the border shifted after certain wars, right? So depending on where the border is between, let's say, the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, you can tell where to situate between wars this particular map in that regard. But this is not a perfect science. One of the issues is that oftentimes when these maps are being printed, the copper plate is already made. And decades later, they might end up printing the same copper plate over and over again and circulating them, right? And the date is going to show the initial date. And so oftentimes you have this. So I give the Caspian Ocean example because even sometimes decades after essentially the map of the Caspian Ocean was in a very detailed way outlined and studied, some Mkhitarist congregation maps that are still being printed actually do not have those details and offer, show the Caspian as some kind of oval-shaped sea. Now, a few hundred copies of the 4 map sets and Dacian engraved were printed over the years, often also colored, and this was the demand for colored maps, there was a demand for it, and shipped to Constantinople for sale. For example, one order in November 1789 was for 60 copies to be shipped to Constantinople, according to the congregation's records. While still working on the 4-map set, by the way, you know, this guy pretty much worked for as long as I've been talking, only. I mean, within 4 years, he produces 6 high-quality maps that essentially define this era and this school of map making. And that's his legacy. That's it. So while still working on the 4-map set, Endasyan also completes a map of the Ottoman Empire. It's called Laynadzaval Devutun Osmansots in 1787. 2,000 copies were shipped to Constantinople in 1788. Endasyan was engraving his maps in declining health. On 5 March 1789, he dies in Varaždin, modern-day Croatia, where the congregation's abbot had sent him to recover. A complete set of Endasyan's continental maps is housed in the Geography and Map Division of the Library of Congress, while the library's African and Middle Eastern Division carries a wealth of materials, again, you know, related to this, some of which I just used in my talk. It's worth noting that, and this was a particularly moving experience for me. After finding out about these four maps, it became clear first that the library only had digitized 2 of them. And you know, we didn't even know about the fact that we had the other 2. And so over the past couple of years, we've digitized all 4, and they're all available for research. So in many ways today, it's, you know, these high-resolution scans now spread Endasyan's legacy to the 4 corners of the world, a fitting tribute to a man who lived to bring the 4 corners of the world to Armenians. It's in the different works that we have references to Endasyan. I would say the most critical being Sahak Cemcemian's work, Kavdi Sakucyan Tebrotsma Surp Ghazavi Mech Dasnuterotavun, a school of cartography at San Lazzaro in the 18th century. This was published in 1981. Right? This is the one work I would say that goes, offers the most in-depth insight into the school of cartography, and particularly, and there's around, I would say, 10 pages about Endasyan's maps there. There are other works that sort of talk a little bit about these maps, including Galician, the first speaker of this series, the noted Armenian scholar and of the history of Armenian cartography. And I do use some of his work in my talk. And Stepanian, he has a work, this is published in 1957, titled Հայ Քավդեսակրական հրատարակությունները եւ 60 դարում. The Armenian cartographic publications over 260 years, from 1695 to 1955. And this is published during Soviet times in 1957. It's very difficult, even those scholars who've worked in the archives of the Mkhitarists, to figure out, you know, anything about Endasyan's life before he started making these maps. Say that he just appears in the records in this period, in this like few years about which I just talked, right? But I have been able to trace some records that connect to his childhood and the fact that he, you know, and the school he went, which was also a Mkhitarist school. And I'm trying to put the pieces together for a short biography of this phenomenal artist and mapmaker. Now, I'm happy to talk more about the different aspects of you know, cartography in this period, but I will, for the interest of time, I will be moving on to a few others. This is just a detail of the Europe section of the map that Endasyan does. Now, the second map that I'm going to be talking about is actually a map that I just viewed last Friday. So what you will hear here is just basic information, but again, it's another phenomenal thing. I had learned about this map, a couple of months ago from my colleague who is responsible for the Ethiopian collections at the Library of Congress, but I just got the chance to view it and started working on it. And this is a map of Ethiopia. It's referred to as the Haile Selassie map. It is in Amharic, and its Armenian connection is the mapmaker. So Haile Selassie's court mapmaker was an Armenian named Papazian. You're going to see more from this. And Papazian in 1923 produces this phenomenal, huge map. This is his signature on the map of Ethiopia, based on British war maps of the region, War Office maps of the region from earlier, from 1908. So the map is being produced in the 1920s, but some of the information on there is actually dated, right? And it dates back to earlier period. This is the map in the Geography and Map division when I was viewing it. I placed that piece of paper over there just for you to have some kind of sense of the dimensions of it. It's huge. And this is the Emperor Haile Selassie visiting the Library of Congress 30 years almost after he gives the map as a gift in 1924 to a geographer and botanist who then, American geographer and botanist who then ends up donating to the Library of Congress. 30 years later, Emperor Haile Selassie visits the library, visits Washington, and this is him standing in front of that map. Again, there is some research, I am told, on this map, and again, I just started exploring this, but I did want to share it because it is a wonderful distraction. All right. These are some earlier newspaper accounts from 1935 that sort of, this is from the Washington Post, for example, where it talks about how map Selassie once owned is in the Library of Congress and tells the story of some of the discoveries related to the map. Now, our next map is another phenomenal piece that is not included on lists of Armenian maps in different collections that are published. So, as I mentioned earlier, several scholars have done work on this, on maps, including, as I mentioned, in the 1950s. There's a listing, Stepanian's book lists, maps from the beginning of, 1600s, from the late 1600s all the way into, the Soviet era in the 1950s. And in his list, he does not include this map. It is a map, a plan of Yerevan, produced in 1920. These are the last months of the First Republic, right? And of course, this is before the Yerevan of today is designed, right? Which is happening in modern day, in Soviet Armenia. And just to give you a sense of the level of detail, again, the map is in the Geography and Maps division at the Library of Congress, and a digital version is available, high resolution, online. The map is by Asfazadurian, 1920. You see his name here, right? And again, a phenomenal work. Again, I can offer more detail about these, but I'm conscious about time, so I'm just going to move faster. Now, this map was actually purchased by my predecessor, Dr. Levon Avdoyan. Dr. Levon Avdoyan served as the Armenian Georgian area specialist at the library for over a quarter of a century, from since Armenia's essentially since the early 1990s all the way into 2018 when he retired, and this was a purchase and acquisition by him, and we're certainly grateful that we have it. Now, this is a more recent map, one last map that I wanted to show. It is, this is from the Soviet era, as you notice the date, and I believe NAASR has a copy of this map, has 3 copies of this map. And so this is a more recent map, and it offers, this was a gift to the library I think around a decade ago, and it offers a detailed, essentially map of Soviet Armenia in that period. One of the things that scholars of Soviet Armenian cartography will emphasize is that at this point, Armenian cartography is becoming, an institution in and of itself. It has the influence of course, the Soviet tradition and the resources of a state that is now producing maps, right? And all the advances in map making that have occurred in the 20th century are reflected here. So you do see a different era of map making here that is not that is absent in the earlier ones. Now, one of the and I will conclude here. How are we doing time-wise? We're doing good? Okay. So one of the reasons why maps became something that interested me over the past couple of years actually is related to a geography book, Armenian geography book that I discovered in the Ottoman archives several years ago when I believe George Arjayan was with me on that trip. I was doing work in the Ottoman archives, and so there was a scan in the archives of an entire Armenian geography book that was confiscated from an Armenian who had purchased it, and the Armenian was called for interrogation for owning that book, right? And the main reason for that investigation was the fact that there was a map on there of Armenia that the authorities did not approve of, right? This sort of triggered, my interest into the power of, the representation of maps and what they communicate. And having the opportunity to be working at the Library of Congress gave me the chance to sort of engage with this material more and try to put this together for this presentation, and hopefully ultimately for a short article on the library's collection of maps. Now, just to wrap up very quickly, I want to say a couple more things. Now, the library has the library has a number of divisions, and each division has in its collection has material related to maps, right? So there's a division that's dedicated to maps and geography, and that's where most of these maps are. But you will also find maps in other divisions related, for example, to the Treaty of Sèvres, right? And discussions about maps that are taking place in that context, right? There's going to be samples of maps in those kinds of records. We also have a wealth of maps that are scattered in history books, geography books, books on memory books of different towns and villages, etc., across the Ottoman Empire. So map making in the 20th century and in the late 19th century becomes something that becomes increasingly integrated into the ways in which Armenians start thinking about themselves, the spaces they inhabit, right? And ultimately, on the one hand, I promise not to talk about genocide. So on the one hand, it is this consciousness that is projected and reflected in the maps, right? And there is a heavy price oftentimes that is paid for that, right? And it's no surprise that even today, right, much of the discussion that is going on in the context of the war on Artsakh and today the demarcation, etc., is about maps and is about maps in the Soviet era and the way in which these places were represented and thought about. So with that, I will stop and we'll open for questions. Thank you. And I think this is the time when the real highlight of the evening is invited into the podium, which is the three maps.
Yeah, so is Ani in the room? There's Ani. If I can ask the curators, Ani and Gary, to subtly work their magic behind the scenes here while we're taking questions. And for those who are on Zoom, I'm not sure if I'm in a position to be able to retrieve Zoom questions tonight. So if you post a question on Zoom and it doesn't get answered, I beg your forgiveness right now. But for those of you who are in the room, please ask questions if you have them. Judy Sarian has a question.
Yes, I was interested in the fact that Katchig you found in the Ottoman archives that was, confiscated from someone who had, I guess, purchased the map while they were in Turkey. Is that correct? I remember hearing that story when I was growing up, and I just wondered when was that map confiscated? At what time period?
Yeah, so this is late 1800s, and it's a map in a Armenian geography book. And the book itself is it's a geography book that covers the entire globe, right? But it does have a map of Armenia, which is because of the fact that there's a map of Armenia and there's an image and engraving of Ararat, etc., that becomes the main issue why this particular individual, who again it's fascinating, right? The book that was confiscated is scanned and is available in the Ottoman archives alongside a couple of the documents, including relating to his interrogation. And his book also has, he has, written by hand the date during which, when he acquired the book, etc. So it was this little story through which suddenly, right, a whole experience was unpacked for me, right? This person who went, he mentions also the bookstore from where he bought the map, right? These innocent things that we do, we just buy a geography book, right? And the way in which, again, just one image in that, in that book landed him in that situation. And it's not, it's, what should be shocking is that, more than 100 years since today, in places like Turkey, right, those kinds of crimes still get people into trouble. And that is, just fascinating for me.
Yes, Joe.
When the Mapmakers were sending maps to boys, did the Turkish government intervene, or did they object to this? Because there was Armenia on the map.
Let's restate it for the...
Yes, so...
And also, did the Mapmakers in Vienna, were they involved in making it as well?
Yeah, so two questions. One is, were the Ottoman authorities intervening when the Mkhitarys were sending maps to the Ottoman Empire? And second, were the Mkhitarys in Vienna involved in map making? Let me start with the first. So there are several themes for maps. I didn't go into it again. So for instance, the first map is a world map. The first map that the Mkhitarys produced is actually a map of Yergir Avediats, the Holy Land, right? And of course, it represents Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and the intention there is, of course, religious behind it. And then after that, the Mkhitarys will be producing different types of maps. So there will be historical maps, maps of Armenia in different periods, right? They will be producing maps that can be useful for merchants. They will also be producing maps that are relevant and have to do with the times. So there are maps of the different Russian-Turkish wars that the Mkhitarys will be printing, right? So there's a variety of maps. This set of maps, including maps related to Russian-Turkish wars and the Ottoman Empire maps, do not cause any particular controversy that at least I know of. And if you observe the maps, you would see why, because it doesn't really try to do anything that is particularly problematic in that sense. But I have to say that there is also interest later on in maps of Armenia, in maps of different Armenian kingdoms. And again, I do know that these maps have arrived in Constantinople and have received some distribution. I have not seen a study of how the Ottoman authorities have dealt with this process, so I cannot address that specifically. And yes, the militaries of Vienna were also involved in the map making. By the way, there's this tragic story, in fact, it's a tragedy, that, I did not talk about the very first Armenian map, right, that was produced in Amsterdam. This was, 1695, before the militarists. And in subsequent years, the militarists put a lot of funds into they find where the copper plates of these maps are. They're with the widow of a notable. They try to buy it from her. The first time, she's asking for too much. I believe she asked for 500 liras. And then they try again. Sometime later, they say we can only offer 200. She says no. She says 250. Eventually, the local militarist congregation members will buy it for 220, ship it to Venice, and the same map, the very first map, as I said, it was produced in Armenian, the same map the militaries will start printing again and distributing hundreds of copies of. And this map is, of course, not up to date at that point, right? We're talking now, decades later. The reason I give this example is because, and here's the tragedy, in the 1950s, those copper plates that were discovered, that were purchased, first of all, they were lost, and then they're found. They're purchased, sent to the congregation. In the 1950s, during renovations, they are also lost, and we don't know where they are now. One day, one Armenian scholar somewhere, a scholar of Armenian studies, should write an article about important items and documents that have disappeared from Armenian archives and libraries around the world. And I think we can think of
a lengthy article.
We can think of quite a few items like this that have been lost for a variety of reasons.
Yes, sir.
So you've presented efforts being done, let's say, west of Constantinople. Do we know of any efforts being done east of Constantinople?
Yes, absolutely. In a later period, in fact.
Was.
Oh, yes. So the question is, I talked about efforts, map making west of Constantinople, mainly in Europe. Do we know of map making efforts east of Constantinople? And the answer is yes. There is a tradition of map making that is very much influenced by the Russian school of map making that is emerging later. So I would say in the late 18th, 19th centuries in the Russian Empire, right, in key cities that have Armenian presence. And that is, there is some work on that. In fact, I mentioned Stepanian, who talks about this, 250 years of Armenian mapmaking history. He divides it into 3 periods. The first period is this period, and it's the Militarists are Europe essentially is central, and then he focuses on the region of on the Russian Empire and what is produced there, and then the third period he talks about is what he refers to as the Soviet period, right? And of course, apart from the typical, glorification of, Lenin and the ideology and everything, that period is quite exhaustive because he has access to all these maps, whereas in other cases, his access is less and his lists are not as complete. He, for example, misses the 1920 map that I just showed you, for instance, just one example.
Yes, Gary.
One of the Soviet practices was to make maps deliberately inaccurate so that if a bomb was going to bomb a city using the coordinates, the real city is actually 30 miles away, They said, "Don't, where's the city? It's not there." And that was a deliberate practice about, so in case enemies obtain the maps. Is there any study of inaccuracies deliberately done in Soviet Armenian maps?
I am not aware of that, but that doesn't mean much, because it's not my area. Soviet Armenian maps, I don't think so. But Soviet maps in general, there may very well be. Yeah.
Are these maps were sent to Istanbul to Patriarchate or the Patriarchate or to Ottoman people? So who's going to buy the Armenian map?
Yeah, great question. Where are these maps sent? Are they sent to Armenians or to the Patriarchate, or are they sent to Ottoman Empire in general? Most of the market are primarily Armenians, Armenian schools, Armenian churches. So that's the primary market. But it's not just Armenians. So we have records, for instance, that the Vatican requests copies of some of these maps and says it's important for us to have it in our collection. And then they, and then they receive. What the Mkhitarist do is not only do they send them a copy of each map that is being requested, but they also send them everything else that they have. So you do have interest outside of Armenian circles, but it's worth noting that overwhelmingly these are maps in Armenian that are being sent, typically the main market are Armenians, largely in Constantinople, but also everywhere from around Europe to India to beyond. It's also worth noting that here I gave examples of maps, but there's also atlases that are produced. And the Mkhitarist also have a number of phenomenal works in that regard, particularly beginning in the 1800s. And the Library of Congress, again, has several copies of these early, very impressive atlases. One thing that's worth noting about this period is that, again, even in the atlases that the Mkhitarist have produced, you will see that within the same atlas, you will have one map where, for example, the Caspian Sea is represented in the way it is, in the modern period. And then another one is represented differently. And yes, we now have the, by the way, this is, we take this for granted, right? But all of these maps that are produced by the Mkhitarist are following the European Convention of the time, which also means we know which way points north, right? Which is, it's again, a lot of what you see here is very much a product of, the European Convention of the time. It's also worth noting that the very first map that is produced, right, is one that is most likely, again, there is a significant part of the work is actually done by European map makers with assistance by Armenians. And this is also a period where there's a lot of work that's being done on transliteration, right? You can imagine the kind of wealth of work that goes into, first of all, not just identifying the locations of these places, but also coming up with Armenian equivalents for them, right? So this early period is also a time when this is being experimented. And in some of these maps, the same place is going to be called something different, sometimes even in the same atlas. And it's a phenomenal, it's a fascinating tidbit in that regard.
George, in the back.
The maps that you showed, the Americas, Africa, and Europe, seem very accurate to me by modern standards. And I find that amazing to be produced in the 1700s. How much information was the Mauritanian community privy to various institutions from, let's say, the Dutch, the English, or the French? Was there a coalescence of these various assistants kind of conferring together in San Lazaro and saying, was there like picking the best points from each school, let's say, and coalescing their own school as such? Because some of the finest maps I've seen, some of them looks almost like primordial from that era, but this
Yes.
seems to be quite accurate.
Absolutely. I think Endazian brings this, map making into a different level. I think, as I said, he single-handedly just puts his stamp within a few years and makes history for Armenian map making. So as far as influences are concerned, it's worth noting that you do have, the Dutch influence. Again, if you see the names of some of the map makers that in the earlier era that the Mkhitaryists are collaborating with, right? It gives you a sense. But they are in the heart of Europe, right? And they are privy to every development that's going on in the heart of Europe. The fact that Endazian is publishing a book about gas, balloons, the book is out 2 years, less than 2 years after the first trial, right? And this is something that it's not just like, this is, preparing, engraving these books is tremendous work, is testament to that kind of connection. So yes, there's several, influences. So again, I'm not a cartography expert, but based on what I've read, there's a lot of Italian, as you can imagine, influence here, Dutch, German, etc. All of it seeping into these maps. But it's worth noting that there's also the local expertise. So the Mkhitaryists themselves in this period are compiling and publishing important works of geography. And that's important to note as well. And also dictionaries, where some of these words are entering into essentially mainstream use. Now, so this is, it's that kind of period. So in many ways, you have the local expertise, as you mentioned, right, of these scholars who are producing these works, coming together with the external expertise. One example to give for this, we do have a case where there is a map that is produced of the Ottoman Empire that is in the works by the Mkhitaryists and is almost going to go to print. And you have a Mkhitarist, a member of the Mkhitarist congregation visiting the region, the Ottoman Empire, and he writes a letter in haste back to Venice, telling them, hold the presses. Many of the things that are on that map, he had a sample with him, are actually wrong because I'm right here, right? And I can see the mistakes. The map eventually gets published. But the point is that you do see that, we are talking about people who are very much invested in what they're doing and in ways, and they're really constantly trying to improve and serve this community that they believe is central for their work. So I do think that these maps are serving a purpose, a religious purpose, of course. They're serving a purpose in terms of creating that kind of national awareness and awakening, right? And you can see how these can be amazing tools. Schools start, demanding more and more of them. One point to say is that also, in many of these cases, the demand goes up and down. Typically, there's a lot of demand early on, and then it's, there's less interest. So they get excited sometimes, the Mkhitarist congregation, and they start printing way too many, right? And then they say, well, what are we going to do with these maps? So you have that as well happening in certain cases.
Yes.
Could we see the Republic of Armenia map again?
Yes.
Yeah. What year was this published?
1920,
32.
Sorry, 32. Is there anything specific you'd like to see on it? You want to look at the borders?
It's a very specific map.
The Turkish border is not shown correctly. And Nakhichevan.
Yeah, no, there.
Turkey is not connected.
Yeah,
That was sold later on by Iran. When was it
39,
sold?
I think, was done.
yeah.
Between Turkey and Nakhichevan, there is a road now. That doesn't show on that map.
Yeah. And you notice here it says Nakhichevan Soviet Khortayn Harabirchun.
You see, Turkey and Nakhichevan are not connected.
Yeah,
Right there.
exactly.
The
Here.
Turkey is not connected to Nakhichevan.
That was changed when, in the later 30s?
Yeah, I think
Yes, Nano.
Earlier in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned audiences. To what degree can we look at maps as political acts, or like the different audiences, say the authorities or the general public at the time? To what degree do they see map making as a political act? To what degree do the map makers see
Well, it's a great question, and
Do repeat it.
okay. It's such a great question. I can repeat it. No. So, in what ways are maps, political, from the perspective of those who are producing them in these different periods, from the perspective of those who are consuming them? Right? Is that sort of the general?
The authorities, the public, say like the Armenians or the
Yeah.
and also from us today.
Yeah. So one example would be discussions about the meridian and where do certain lines have to pass through, right? And just, I want to give this example just to illustrate how, in the minds of some of these map makers, Armenia was prominent, even when the map itself was not sort of focused on Armenia. So there were attempts, for instance, to actually have the meridian pass through Mount Ararat, right? Of course, it doesn't catch on, as you can imagine. But the point is that, so you do have experiments such as this, right? Or the maps that are produced of, again, there's clearly, it's, the decision, if you think about it, the very first map that the Mkhitaris are producing is of Jerusalem, right? Is of Avediat Yevgir, right? Of the Holy Land. And again, that carries a certain kind of meaning. The second map that they produce is of, they start moving towards Armenia, right? And then there are the wars, and these are major events in the lives of people. So they are reacting to a couple of things. One is they are trying to educate and inform and influence, but at the same time they're reacting to demand. So there is in the correspondence references to the fact that there is interest in maps about the wars that are taking place between the Ottomans and Russians, for instance, right? And then because there is interest, they will produce the maps in that sense. But I think the bigger question that you are asking is one that I don't think I can sort of, it's not my area of expertise to really give you a very informed answer, right? I have to say, though, that the scholarship on Armenian mapmaking specifically is not that rich for this period, right? There's a lot more works on the Soviet period, understandably, but I do think there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and I also can tell you that I'm not the person who can do that, I don't have the training for it.
But a map, any map is not just a map, right? They're works of art. They convey detailed information, and even if the map makers don't intend them as such, they're political statements.
Yeah.
They're going to be viewed as political statements by somebody looking at them. It's a really good question. What political statements do these maps make? Obviously, a Soviet Armenian map in 1932 is trying to make a particular kind of political statement that a Mkhitaryan map from the 18th century is not making. Or maybe they are making a similar political statement. I don't know.
It's worth noting that the books that I mentioned, for instance, and except some of the Armenian language works that are emerging now with younger scholars who are working on maps, a lot of it is either descriptive. Initially there's always this effort to establish the history, right? And I think there's enough out there now for us to move on to start answering these kinds of questions that would require more in-depth research. Something that, by the way, works on European mapmaking when it comes to these kinds of questions. There's a lot of scholarship on it for every century, right? But in Armenian studies, it's not something that has that kind of there isn't much work on that. Even though there is a lot of important scholarship that sets the groundwork for thinking about these maps. So, for example, Sebo Aslanyan's work about trade routes, Mediterranean, merchant, and the entire and other works that have emerged since on the subject. There's a lot of publications on the works of Mkhitarists in general, because there too, again, there are ways in which we can look at the works on geography and history that the Mkhitarists are producing, and the ways in which they are reflecting in the map making. At the same time, how you have these other influences that are shaping shaping much of this.
I suggest we stop there. Applaud Katchig. And those of you who are here, yes, are invited to take a good, close, but not too close, look
Yes.
at the beautiful maps.
I'd like to thank again, sorry
Yeah,
Mark, for cutting
please.
you off.
I was going to thank the museum, but you do so.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the Armenian Museum of America for making this possible. I would have, it just added a lot to this, and it gave me an opportunity to see it even more closely than I can at the Library of Congress. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mark.
All right. Good. Have a good evening.